The captives redoubled their efforts. Their lacerated fingers bled, but still they dug on. After half an hour's labor, the hole they were drilling had reached a depth of 3 feet. They could perceive by the sounds, which were now more distinct, that only a thin layer of earth prevented immediate communication. A few moments more elapsed, when suddenly the major drew back his hand, which was cut by a sharp blade. He suppressed a cry that was about to escape him. Captain Mangles, holding out his poniard, avoided the knife that was moving out of the ground but seized the hand that held it. It was the hand of a woman or a youth, a European hand. Not a word had been uttered on either side. There was plainly an object in keeping silent. "Is it Robert?" murmured Glenarvan. But though only whispering this name, Mary Grant, awakened by the movement that was taking place in the hut, glided towards Glenarvan, and seizing this hand all soiled with mud, covered it with kisses. "It is you," cried the young girl who could not be mistaken, "you, my Robert." "Yes, little sister," replied Robert, "I am here to save you all, but silence." "Brave lad," repeated Glenarvan. "Keep watch of the savages outside," continued Robert. Mulrady, whose attention had been diverted for a moment by the appearance of the hand, resumed his post of observation. "All is well," said he. "Only 4 warriors are watching now, the others have fallen asleep." "Courage," replied Wilson. In an instant the hole was widened, and Robert passed from the arms of his sister into those of Lady Helena. Around his body was wound a rope of flax. My boy," murmured Lady Helena, "these savages did not kill you." "No, madam," replied Robert. "Somehow, during the uproar I succeeded in escaping their vigilance. I crossed the yard. For 2 days I kept hidden behind the bushes. At night I wandered about, longing to see you again. While the tribe were occupied with the funeral of the chief, I came and examined this side of the fortification, where the prison stands, and saw that I could reach you. I stole this knife and rope in a deserted hut. The tufts of grass in the bushes helped me to climb. By chance I found a kind of grotto hollowed out in the very rock against which this hut rests. I had only a few feet to dig in the soft earth, and here I am." 20 silent kisses were his only answer. "Let us start," said he in a decided tone. "Is Paganel below?" inquired Glenarvan. "Mr. Paganel," repeated the boy, surprised apparently at the question. "Yes, is he waiting for us?" "No, my lord, what, is he not here?" "He is not, Robert," replied Mary Grant. "What, have you not seen him?" exclaimed Glenarvan. "Did you not meet each other in the confusion? Did you not escape together?" "No, my lord," answered Robert, at a loss to understand the disappearance of his friend Paganel. "Let us start," said the major. "There is not a moment to lose. Wherever Paganel may be, his situation cannot be worse than ours here. Let us go." Indeed, the moments were precious. It was high time to start. The escape presented no great difficulties, but for the almost perpendicular wall of rock outside of the grotto, 20 feet high. The declivity then sloped quite gently to the base of the mountain, from which point the captives could quickly gain the lower valleys, while the Maoris, if they chanced to discover their flight, would be forced to make a very long detour, since they were not aware of the passage that had been dug in the mountain. First her husband, and then she, slid down the rope to the point where the perpendicular wall met the summit of the slope. They now prepared to escape, and every precaution was taken to ensure their success. The captives crawled one by one through the narrow passage and found themselves in the grotto. Captain Mangles, before leaving the hut, concealed all traces of their work and glided in his turn through the opening, which he closed with the mats. Their outlet was therefore entirely hidden. The object now was to descend the perpendicular wall of rock, which would have been impossible if Robert had not brought the flax rope. It was unwound, fastened to a point of rock, and thrown over the declivity. Before allowing his friends to trust their weight to these flaxen fibers, Captain Mangles tested them. They seemed to be quite strong, but it would not answer to venture rashly, for a fall might be fatal. "This rope," said he, "can only bear the weight of 2 bodies, and we must therefore act accordingly. Let Lord and Lady Glenarvan slide down first. When they have reached the bottom, 3 shakes at the rope will be the signal to follow them." "I will go first," replied Robert. "I have discovered at the base of the slope a sort of deep excavation, where those who descend first can wait for the others in safety." "Go then, my boy," said Glenarvan, clasping the boy's hand. Robert disappeared through the opening of the grotto. A moment after, 3 shakes of the rope informed them that he had accomplished his descent successfully. Glenarvan and Lady Helena now ventured out of the grotto. The darkness below was still profound, but the gray light of dawn was already tinging the top of the mountain. The keen cold of the morning reanimated the young wife. She felt stronger and commenced her perilous escape. A precipitate descent. First her husband, and then she slid down the rope to the point where the perpendicular wall met the summit of the slope. Then Glenarvan, going before his wife and assisting her, began to descend the declivity of the mountain backwards. He sought for tufts of grass and bushes that offered a point of support, and tried them before placing Lady Helena's feet upon them. Several birds, suddenly awakened, flew away with shrill cries, and the fugitives shuddered when a large stone rolled noisily to the base of the mountain. They had accomplished half the distance, when a voice was heard at the opening of the grotto. "Stop," whispered Captain Mangles. Glenarvan, clinging with one hand to a tuft of grass, and holding his wife with the other, waited, scarcely breathing. Wilson had taken alarm. Hearing some noise outside, he had returned to the hut, and raising the mat, watched the Maoris. At a sign from him, the captain had stopped Glenarvan. In truth, one of the warriors, startled by some unaccustomed sound, had risen and approached the prison. Standing 2 paces from the hut, he listened with lowered head. He remained in this attitude for a moment, that seemed an hour, with ear intent and eye on the alert. Then, shaking his head as a man who is mistaken, he returned to his companions, took an armful of dead wood and threw it on the half-extinct fire, whose flames revived. His face, brightly illumined by the blaze, betrayed no more anxiety, and after gazing at the first glimmers of dawn that tinged the horizon, he stretched himself beside the fire to warm his cold limbs. "All right," said Wilson. The captain made a sign to Glenarvan to continue his descent. The latter, accordingly, slid gently down the slope, and soon Lady Helena and he stood on the narrow path where Robert was waiting for them. The rope was shaken 3 times, and next Captain Mangles, followed by Mary Grant, took the same perilous course. They were successful, and joined Lord and Lady Glenarvan. 5 minutes later all the fugitives, after their fortunate escape from the hut, left this temporary retreat, and avoiding the inhabited shores of the lake, made their way by narrow paths farther down the mountain. They advanced rapidly, seeking to avoid all points where they might be seen. They did not speak but glided like shadows through the bushes. Where were they going? At random, it is true, but they were free. About 5 o'clock day began to break. Purple tints colored the lofty banks of clouds. The mountain peaks emerged from the mists of the morning. The orb of day would not be long in appearing, and instead of being the signal for torture, was to betray the flight of the condemned. Before this dreaded moment arrived, it was important that the fugitives should be beyond the reach of the savages. But they could not advance quickly, for the paths were steep. Lady Helena scaled the declivities, supported and even carried by Glenarvan, while Mary Grant leaned upon the arm of her betrothed. Robert, happy and triumphant, whose heart was full of joy at his success, took the lead, followed by the 2 sailors. For half an hour the fugitives wandered at a venture. Paganel was not there to guide them. Paganel, the object of their fears, whose absence cast a dark shadow over their happiness. However, they proceeded towards the east as well as possible, in the face of a magnificent dawn. They had soon reached an elevation of 500 feet above Lake Taupo, and the morning air at this altitude was keen and cold. Hills and mountains rose one above another in indistinct outlines, but Glenarvan only wished to conceal himself and his companions. Afterwards they would see about issuing from this winding labyrinth. They saw, but were also seen. At last the sun appeared and flashed his first rays into the faces of the fugitives. Suddenly a terrible yelling, the concentrated union of 100 voices, broke forth upon the air. It rose from the paw, whose exact position Glenarvan did not now know. Moreover, a thick curtain of mist stretched at their feet, and prevented them from distinguishing the valleys below. But the fugitives could not doubt that their escape had been discovered. Could they elude the pursuit of the natives? Had they been perceived, would their tracks betray them? At this moment the lower strata of vapor rose, enveloping them for an instant in a moist cloud, and they discerned, 300 feet below them, the frantic crowd of savages. They saw but were also seen. Renewed yells resounded, mingled with barks, and the whole tribe, after vainly endeavoring to climb the rock, rushed out of the enclosure and hastened by the shortest paths in pursuit of the prisoners, who fled in terror from their vengeance. Chapter 52. The Sacred Mountain. The summit of the mountain was 100 feet higher. It was important for the fugitives to reach it, that they might conceal themselves from the sight of the Maoris, on the opposite slope. They hoped that some practicable ridge would then enable them to gain the neighboring peaks. The ascent was, therefore, hastened, as the threatening cries came nearer and nearer. The pursuers had reached the foot of the mountain. "Courage, courage, my friends!" cried Glenarvan, urging his companions with word and gesture. A scene of enchantment. In less than 5 minutes, they reached the top of the mountain. Here they turned around to consider their situation and take some route by which they might evade the Maoris. From this height the prospect commanded Lake Taupo, which extended towards the west in its picturesque frame of hills. To the north rose the peaks of Pyrongia, to the south the flaming crater of Tongariro. But towards the east the view was limited by a barrier of peaks and ridges. Glenarvan cast an anxious glance around him. The mist had dissolved under the rays of the sun, and his eye could clearly distinguish the least depressions of the earth. No movement of the Maoris could escape his sight. The natives were not 500 feet distant when they reached the plateau upon which the solitary peak rested. Glenarvan could not, for ever so short a time, delay longer. At all hazards they must fly, at the risk of being hemmed in on all sides. "Let us go down," cried he, "before our only way of escape is blocked up." But just as the ladies rose by a final effort, Mac Nab stopped them and said, "It is useless, Glenarvan, look." And all saw, indeed, that an inexplicable change had taken place in the movements of the Maoris. Their pursuit had been suddenly interrupted. Their ascent of the mountain had ceased, as if by an imperious interdict. The crowd of natives had checked their swiftness, and halted, like the waves of the sea before an impassable rock. All the savages, thirsting for blood, were now ranged along the foot of the mountain, yelling, gesticulating, and brandishing guns and hatchets, but they did not advance a single foot. Their dogs, like themselves, as though chained to earth, howled with rage. What was the difficulty? What invisible power restrained the natives? The fugitives gazed without comprehending, fearing that the charm that enchained Kaikumu's tribe would dissolve. Suddenly Captain Mangles uttered a cry that caused his companions to turn. He pointed to a little fortress at the summit of the peak. "The tomb of the chief Karatit," cried Robert. "Are you in earnest?" asked Glenarvan. "Yes, my lord, it is the tomb. I recognize it." Robert was right. 50 feet above, at the extreme point of the mountain, stood a small palisaded enclosure of freshly painted stakes. Glenarvan, likewise, recognized the sepulchre of the Maori chief. In their wanderings they had come to the top of the Maunganamu, where Karatit had been buried. Followed by his companions, he climbed the sides of the peak to the very foot of the tomb. A large opening, covered with mats, formed the entrance. Glenarvan was about to enter, when all at once he started back suddenly. "A savage," said he. "A savage in this tomb?" inquired the major. "Yes, Mac Nab." "What matter? Let us enter." Glenarvan, the major, Robert, and Captain Mangles passed into the enclosure. A Maori was there, clad in a great flax mantle. The darkness of the sepulchre did not permit them to distinguish his features. He appeared very calm, and was eating his breakfast with the most perfect indifference. Glenarvan was about to address him, when the native, anticipating him, said, in an amiable tone and in excellent English, "Be seated, my dear lord. Breakfast is awaiting you." It was Paganel. At his voice all rushed into the tomb and gazed with wonder at the worthy geographer. Paganel was found. The common safety was represented in him. They were going to question him. They wished to know how and why he was on the top of the mountain, but Glenarvan checked this unseasonable curiosity. "Be seated, my dear lord. Breakfast is awaiting you." "The savages," said he. "The savages," replied Paganel, shrugging his shoulders, "are individuals whom I supremely despise." "But can they not? They, the imbeciles, come and see them." Each followed Paganel, who issued from the tomb. The Maoris were in the same place, surrounding the foot of the peak and uttering terrible cries. "Cry and howl till you are tired, miserable creatures," said Paganel. "I defy you to climb this mountain." "And why?" asked Glenarvan. "Because the chief is buried here, this tomb protects us, and the mountain is tabooed." "Tabooed?" "Yes, my friends, and that is why I took refuge here, as in one of those asylums of the Middle Ages, open to unfortunates." Indeed, the mountain was tabooed, and by this consecration had become inaccessible by the superstitious savages. The safety of the fugitives was not yet certain, but there was a salutary respite, of which they strove to take advantage. Glenarvan, a prey to unspeakable emotion, did not venture a word, while the Major nodded his head with an air of genuine satisfaction. "And now, my friends," said Paganel, "if these brutes expect us to test their patience, they are mistaken. In 2 days we shall be beyond the reach of these rascals." "We will escape," said Glenarvan, "but how?" "I do not know," replied Paganel, "but we will do so all the same." All now wished to hear the geographer's adventures. Strangely enough, in the case of a man loquacious usually, it was necessary to draw, as it were, the words from his mouth. He, who was so fond of telling stories, replied only in an evasive way to the questions of his friends. "Paganel has changed," thought MacNab. The worth of spectacles. Indeed, the countenance of the geographer was no longer the same. He wrapped himself gloomily in his great flaxen mantle, and seemed to shun too inquisitive looks. However, when they were all seated around him at the foot of the tomb, he related his experiences. After the death of Karateet, Paganel had taken advantage, like Robert, of the confusion of the natives, and escaped from the paw. But less fortunate than young Grant, he had fallen upon an encampment of Maoris, who were commanded by a chief of fine form and intelligent appearance, who was evidently superior to all the warriors of his tribe. This chief spoke English accurately, and bade him welcome by rubbing his nose against that of the geographer. Paganel wondered whether he should consider himself a prisoner, but seeing that he could not take a step without being graciously accompanied by the chief, he soon knew how matters stood on this point. The chief, whose name was Hihi, Sunbeam, was not a bad man. The spectacles and telescope gave him a high opinion of Paganel, whom he attached carefully to his person, not only by his benefits, but by strong flaxen ropes, especially at night. This novel situation lasted 3 long days. Was he well or badly treated? Both, as he stated without further explanation. In short, he was a prisoner, and, except for the prospect of immediate torture, his condition did not seem more enviable than that of his unfortunate friends. Fortunately, last night he succeeded in biting asunder his ropes and escaping. He had witnessed at a distance the burial of the chief, knew that he had been interred on the summit of Maunganamu Mountain, and that it was tabooed in consequence. He therefore resolved to take refuge there, not wishing to leave the place where his companions were held captives. He succeeded in his undertaking, arrived at Karateet's tomb, and waited in hope that Providence would in some way deliver his friends. Such was Paganel's story. Did he omit designedly any circumstance of his stay among the natives? More than once his embarrassment led them to suspect so. However that might be, he received unanimous congratulations, and as the past was now known, they returned to the present. Their situation was still exceedingly critical. The natives, if they did not venture to climb the mountain, expected that hunger and thirst would force their prisoners to surrender. It was only a matter of time, and the savages had great patience. Glenarvan did not disregard the difficulties of his position, but waited for the favorable issue which Providence seemed to promise. And first he wished to examine this improvised fortress, not to defend it, for an attack was not to be feared, but that he might find a way of escaping. The Major and the captain, Robert, Paganel, and himself, took the exact bearings of the mountain. They observed the direction of the paths, their branches and declivities. A ridge a mile in length united the Maunganamu to the Wahiti Range, and then declined to the plain. Its narrow and winding summit presented the only practicable route, in case escape should become possible. If the fugitives could pass this point unperceived, under cover of the night, perhaps they might succeed in reaching the deep valleys and outwitting the Maoris. But this course offered more than one danger, as they would have to pass below within gunshot. The bullets of the natives on the lower ramparts of the Pa might intercept them, and form a barrier that no one could safely cross. Glenarvan and his friends, as soon as they ventured on the dangerous part of the ridge, were saluted with a volley of shots, but only a few wads, borne by the wind, reached them. They were made of printed paper. Paganel picked them up out of curiosity, but it was difficult to decipher them. A strange colporteur. "Why," said he, "do you know, my friends, what these creatures use for wads in their guns?" "No," replied Glenarvan. "Leaves of the Bible. If this is the use they make of the sacred writings, I pity the missionaries. They will have difficulty in founding Maori libraries." "In what passage of the scriptures have these natives fired at us?" asked Glenarvan. "A mighty promise of God," replied Captain Mangles, who had also read the paper. "It bids us hope in him," added the young captain, with the unshaken conviction of his Scottish faith. "Read, John," said Glenarvan. He read this line, which had so strangely reached them. "Because he hath set his love upon me, therefore will I deliver him." Psalm xci. I. "My friends," said Glenarvan, "we must make known the words of hope to our brave and dear ladies. Here is something to reanimate their hearts." Glenarvan and his companions ascended the steep paths of the peak, and proceeded towards the tomb which they wished to examine. On the way they were astonished to feel, at short intervals, a certain trembling of the ground. It was not an irregular agitation, but that continued vibration which the sides of a boiler undergo when it is fully charged. Steam, in large quantities, generated by the action of subterranean fires, seemed to be working beneath the crust of the mountain. This peculiarity could not astonish people who had passed between the warm springs of the Waikato. They knew that this region of Insurmountable is volcanic. It is like a sieve, from the holes of which ever issue the vapors of subterranean laboratories. Paganel, who had already observed this, called the attention of his friends to the circumstance. The Maunganamu is only one of those numerous cones that cover the central portion of the island. The least mechanical action could provoke the formation of a crater in the clayey soil. "And yet," said Glenarvan, "we seem to be in no more danger here than beside the boiler of the Duncan. This crust is firm." "Certainly," replied the Major, "but a boiler, however strong it may be, will always burst at last after too long use." "MacNab," said Paganel, "I do not desire to remain on this peak. Let heaven show me a way of escape, and I will leave it instantly." Lady Helena, who perceived Lord Glenarvan, now approached. "My dear Edward," said she, "you have considered our position. Are we to hope or fear?" "Hope, my dear Helena," replied Glenarvan. "The natives will never come to the top of the mountain, and we shall have abundant time to form a plan of escape." "Moreover, madam," said Captain Mangles, "God himself encourages us to hope." So saying, he gave her the text of the Bible which had been sent to them. She and Mary Grant, whose confiding soul was always open to the ministrations of heaven, saw, in the words of the Holy Book, an infallible pledge of safety. "Now to the tomb," cried Paganel gaily. "This is our fortress, our castle, our dining room, and our workshop. No one is to disarrange it. Ladies, permit me to do the honors of this charming dwelling." All followed the good-natured Paganel. When the savages saw the fugitives desecrate anew this tabooed sepulchre, they fired numerous volleys, and uttered yells no less terrible. But fortunately their bullets could not reach as far as their cries, for they only came halfway, while their vociferations were lost in empty air. Board and lodging. Lady Helena, Mary Grant, and their companions, quite reassured at seeing that the superstition of the Maoris was still stronger than their rage, entered the tomb. It was a palisade of red-painted stakes. Symbolical faces, a real tattooing on wood, described the nobleness and exploits of the deceased. Strings of pipes, shells, and carved stones extended from one stake to another. Inside, the earth was hidden beneath a carpet of green leaves. In the center, a slight protuberance marked the freshly made grave. Here reposed the weapons of the chief, his guns loaded and primed, his lance, his splendid hatchet of green jade, with a supply of powder and balls sufficient for the hunts of the other world. "Here is a whole arsenal," said Paganel, "of which we will make a better use than the deceased. It is a good idea of these savages to carry their weapons to heaven with them." "But these are English guns," said the Major. "Doubtless," replied Glenarvan. "It is a very foolish custom to make presents of firearms to the savages, who then use them against the invaders, and with reason. At all events, these guns will be useful to us." "But still more useful," said Paganel, will be the provisions and water intended for Karatit. The parents and friends of the dead had indeed faithfully fulfilled their duties. The amount of food testified their esteem for the virtues of the chief. There were provisions enough to last 10 persons 15 days, or rather the deceased for eternity. They consisted of ferns, sweet yams, and potatoes, which were introduced some time before by the Europeans. Tall vases of fresh water stood near, and a dozen baskets, artistically woven, contained numerous tablets of green gum. The fugitives were therefore fortified for several days against hunger and thirst, and they needed no urging to take their first meal at the chief's expense. Glenarvan directed Mr. Albonet's attention to the food necessary for his companions, but he, with his usual exactness, even in critical situations, thought the bill of fare rather scanty. Moreover, he did not know how to prepare the roots, and there was no fire. But Paganel solved the difficulty, and advised him to simply bury his ferns and potatoes in the ground itself, for the heat of the upper strata was very great. Albonet, however, narrowly escaped a serious scalding, for just as he had dug a hole to put his roots in, a stream of watery vapor burst forth, and rose to the height of several feet. The steward started back in terror. "Close the hole," cried the major, who, with the aid of the two sailors, covered the orifice with fragments of pumice stone, while Paganel murmured these words. "Well, well, haha, very natural." "You are not scalded?" inquired MacNab of Albonet. "No, Mr. MacNab," replied the steward, "but I scarcely expected." "So many blessings," added Paganel in a mirthful tone. "Consider Karatit's water and provisions and the fire of the earth. This mountain is a paradise. I propose that we found a colony here, cultivate the soil, and settle for the rest of our days. We will be Robinson Crusoes of Maunganamu. Indeed, I look in vain for any deficiency on this comfortable peak." "Nothing is wanting if the earth is firm," replied Captain Mangles. "Well, it was not created yesterday," said Paganel. "It has long resisted the action of internal fires, and will easily hold out till our departure." "Breakfast is ready," announced Mr. Albonet, as gravely as if he had been performing his duties at Malcolm Castle. The fugitives at once sat down near the palisade, and enjoyed the repast that Providence had so opportunely furnished to them in this critical situation. No one appeared particular about the choice of food, but there was a diversity of opinion concerning the edible ferns. Some found them sweet and pleasant, and others mucilaginous, insipid, and acrid. The sweet potatoes, cooked in the hot earth, were excellent. The steward started back in terror. Their hunger being satiated, Glenarvan proposed that they should, without delay, arrange a plan of escape. "So soon," said Paganel in a truly piteous tone. "What, are you thinking already of leaving this delightful place?" "I think, first of all," replied Glenarvan, "that we ought to attempt an escape before we are forced to it by hunger. We have strength enough yet, and must take advantage of it. Tonight let us try to gain the eastern valleys, and cross the circle of natives under cover of the darkness." "Exactly," answered Paganel, "if the Maoris will let us pass." "And if they prevent us?" asked Captain Mangles. "Then we will employ the great expedients," said Paganel. "You have great expedients then?" inquired the major. "More than I know what to do with," rejoined Paganel, without further explanation. They could now do nothing but wait for night to attempt crossing the line of savages, who had not left their position. Their ranks even seemed increased by stragglers from the tribe. Here and there freshly kindled fires formed a flaming girdle around the base of the peak. When darkness had invaded the surrounding valleys, the Maunganamu seemed to rise from a vast conflagration, while its summit was lost in a dense shade. 600 feet below were heard the tumult and cries of the enemy's camp. At 9 o'clock it was very dark, and Glenarvan and Captain Mangles resolved to make an exploration before taking their companions on this perilous journey. They noiselessly descended the declivity some distance, and reached the narrow ridge that crossed the line of natives 50 feet above the encampment. Another sunrise. All went well so far. The Maoris, stretched beside their fires, did not seem to perceive the two fugitives, who advanced a few paces farther. But suddenly, to the left and right of the ridge, a double volley resounded. "Back!" cried Glenarvan. "These bandits have eyes like a cat, and the guns of riflemen." Captain Mangles and he reascended at once the precipitous slopes of the mountain, and speedily assured their terrified friends of their safety. Glenarvan's hat had been pierced by 2 bullets. It was, therefore, dangerous to venture on the ridge between these 2 lines of marksmen. "Wait till tomorrow," said Paganel, "and since we cannot deceive the vigilance of these natives, permit me to give them a dose in my own way." The temperature was quite cold. Fortunately, Karateet wore in the tomb his best night robes, warm, flaxen coverings, in which each one wrapped himself without hesitation. And soon the fugitives, protected by the native superstition, slept peacefully in the shelter of the palisades, on the earth that seemed to quake with the internal commotion. Chapter 53. A bold stratagem. The rising sun, awakened with his first, raised the sleepers on the Maunganamu. The Maoris for some time had been moving to and fro at the foot of the peak, without wandering from their post of observation. Furious cries saluted the appearance of the Europeans as they issued from the desecrated tomb. Each cast a longing glance towards the surrounding mountains, the deep valleys, still veiled in mist, and the surface of Lake Taupo, gently rippling beneath the morning wind. Then all, eager to know Paganel's new project, gathered around him with questioning looks, while the geographer at once satisfied the restless curiosity of his companions. "My friends," said he, "my project has this advantage, that if it does not produce the result that I expect, or even fails, our situation will not be impaired. But it ought to and will succeed." "And this project?" asked the Major. "This is it," replied Paganel. "The superstition of the natives has made this mountain a place of refuge, and this superstition must help us to escape. If I succeed in convincing Kai Kumu that we have become the victims of our sacrilege, that the wrath of heaven has fallen upon us, in short, that we have met a terrible death, do you think that he will abandon the mountain and return to his village?" "Probably," said Glenarvan. "And with what horrible death do you threaten us?" inquired Lady Helena. "The death of the sacrilegious, my friends," continued Paganel. "The avenging flames are under our feet, let us open a way for them." "What, you would make a volcano?" cried Captain Mangles. "Yes, a factitious, an improvised one, whose fury we will control. There is quite a supply of vapors and subterranean fires that only ask for an outlet. Let us arrange an artificial eruption for our own advantage." "The idea is good," said the Major, "and well conceived, Paganel." "You understand," resumed the geographer, "that we are to feign being consumed by the flames of Pluto, and shall disappear spiritually in the tomb of Karateet. A volcano in miniature, where we shall remain 3, 4, or 5 days, if necessary, till the savages are convinced of our death, and abandon the siege." "But if they think of making sure of our destruction," said Miss Grant, "and climb the mountain?" "No, my dear Mary," replied Paganel, "they will not do that. The mountain is tabooed, and if it shall itself devour its profaners, the taboo will be still more rigorous." "This plan is really well conceived," remarked Glenarvan. "There is only one chance against it, and that is, that the savages may persist in remaining at the foot of the mountain till the provisions fail us. But this is scarcely probable, especially if we play our part skillfully." "And when shall we make this last venture?" asked Lady Helena. "This very evening," answered Paganel, "at the hour of the greatest darkness." "Agreed," said MacNab. "Paganel, you are a man of genius, and although from habit I am scarcely ever enthusiastic, I will answer for your success. Ha, these rascals, we shall perform a little miracle for them that will delay their conversion a good century. May the missionaries pardon us." Paganel's plan was therefore adopted, and really, with the superstitious notions of the Maoris, it might and ought to succeed. It only remained to execute it. The idea was good, but in practice difficult. Might not this volcano consume the audacious ones who should dig the crater? Could they control and direct this eruption when the vapors, flames, and lava should be let loose? Would it not engulf the entire peak in a flood of fire? They were tampering with those phenomena whose absolute control is reserved for forces higher than theirs. Paganel had foreseen these difficulties, but he expected to act prudently and not to venture to extremes. An illusion was enough to deceive the Maoris, without the awful reality of a large eruption. How long that day seemed! Each one counted the interminable hours. Everything was prepared for flight. The provisions of the tomb had been divided and made into convenient bundles. Several mats and the firearms, which had been found in the tomb of the chief, formed light baggage. Of course, these preparations were made within the palisaded enclosure and unknown to the savages. At 6 o'clock, the steward served a farewell feast. Where and when they should eat in the valleys, no one could foretell. Twilight came on. The sun disappeared behind a bank of dense clouds of threatening aspect. A few flashes illumined the horizon, and a distant peal of thunder rumbled along the vault of the sky. Paganel welcomed the storm that came to the aid of his design. At 8 o'clock, the summit of the mountain was hidden by a foreboding darkness, while the sky looked terribly black, as if for a background to the flaming outbreak that Paganel was about to inaugurate. The Maoris could no longer see their prisoners. The time for action had come. Rapidity was necessary, and Glenarvan, Paganel, MacNab, Robert, the steward, and the two sailors at once set to work vigorously. The place for the crater was chosen 30 paces from Karatete's tomb. It was important that this structure should be spared by the eruption, for otherwise the taboo would become ineffective. Paganel had observed an enormous block of stone, around which the vapors seemed to pour forth with considerable force. This rocky mass covered a small natural crater in the peak, and only by its weight prevented the escape of the subterranean flames. If they could succeed in overturning it, the smoke and lava would immediately issue through the unobstructed opening. Vulcans at work. The fugitives made themselves levers out of the stakes of the tomb, and with these they vigorously attacked the ponderous mass. Under their united efforts, the rock was not long in moving. They dug a sort of groove for it down the side of the mountain, that it might slide on an inclined plane. As their action increased, the trembling of the earth became more violent. Hollow rumblings and hissings sounded under the thin crust, but the bold experimenters, like real Vulcans, governing the underground fires, worked on in silence. Several cracks and a few gusts of hot smoke warned them that their position was becoming dangerous. But a final effort detached the block, which glided down the slope of the mountain and disappeared. The thin covering at once yielded. An incandescent column poured forth towards the sky with loud explosions, while streams of boiling water and lava rolled towards the encampment of the natives and the valleys below. The whole peak trembled, and you might almost have thought that it was disappearing in a general conflagration. Glenarvan and his companions had scarcely time to escape the shock of the eruption. They fled to the enclosure of the tomb, but not without receiving a few scalding drops of the water, which bubbled and exhaled a strong sulphurous odor. Then mud, lava, and volcanic fragments mingled in the scene of devastation. Torrents of flame furrowed the sides of the Maunganamu. The adjoining mountains glowed in the light of the eruption, and the deep valleys were illumined with a vivid brightness. The savages were soon aroused, both by the noise and the heat of the lava that flowed in a scalding tide through the midst of their encampment. Those whom the fiery flood had not reached fled, and ascended the surrounding hills, turning and gazing back at this terrific phenomenon, with which their god, in his wrath, had overwhelmed the desecrators of the sacred mountain, while at certain moments they were heard howling their consecratory cry. Taboo, taboo, taboo. The fugitives made themselves levers out of the stakes of the tomb. An incandescent column poured forth towards the sky with loud explosions, while streams of boiling water and lava rolled towards the encampment of the natives. Meantime, an enormous quantity of vapor, melted stones, and lava had escaped from the crater. It was no longer a simple geyser. All this volcanic effervescence had hitherto been confined beneath the crust of the peak, since the outlets of Tongariro sufficed for its expansion. But as a new opening had been made, it had rushed forth with extreme violence. All night long, during the storm that raged above and below, the peak was shaken with a commotion that could not but alarm Glenarvan. The prisoners, concealed behind the palisade of the tomb, watched the fearful progress of the outbreak. Morning came. The fury of the volcano had not moderated. Thick, yellowish vapors mingled with the flames, and torrents of lava poured in every direction. Glenarvan, with eye alert and beating heart, glanced between the interstices of the enclosure and surveyed the camp of the Maoris. The natives had fled to the neighboring plateaus, beyond the reach of the volcano. Several corpses, lying at the foot of the peak, had been charred by the fire. Farther on, towards the Pa, the lava had consumed a number of huts that were still smoking. The savages, in scattered groups, were gazing at the vapory summit of Maunganamu with religious awe. Kaikumu came into the midst of his warriors, and Glenarvan recognized him. The chief advanced to the base of the peak, on the side spared by the eruption, but did not cross the first slopes. Here, with outstretched arms, like a sorcerer exercising, he made a few grimaces, the meaning of which did not escape the prisoners. As Paganel had foreseen, Kai-Koumou was invoking upon the mountain a more rigorous taboo. Soon after, the natives descended, in single file, the winding paths that led towards the Pa. A weary waiting. "They are going," cried Glenarvan. "They are abandoning their post. God be thanked, our scheme has succeeded. My dear Helena, my brave companions, we are now dead and buried. But this evening we will revive, we will leave our tomb, and flee from these barbarous tribes." It would be difficult to describe the joy that reigned within the palisade. Hope had reanimated all hearts. These courageous travelers forgot their past trials, dreaded not the future, and only rejoiced in their present deliverance. Although very little reflection would show how difficult was the task of reaching an European settlement from their present position. But if Kai-Koumou was outwitted, they believed themselves safe from all the savages of New Zealand. A whole day must pass before the decisive attempt could be made, and they employed their time in arranging a plan of escape. Paganel had preserved his map of New Zealand, and could therefore search out the safest routes. After some discussion, the fugitives resolved to proceed eastward towards the Bay of Plenty. This course would lead them through districts that were very rarely visited. The travelers, who were already accustomed to overcoming natural difficulties, only feared meeting the Maoris. They therefore determined to avoid them at all hazards and gain the eastern coast, where the missionaries have founded several establishments. Moreover, this portion of the island had hitherto escaped the ravages of the war and the depredations of the natives. As for the distance that separated Lake Taupo from the Bay of Plenty, it could not be more than 100 miles. 10 days would suffice for the journey. The missions once reached, they could rest there and wait for some favorable opportunity of gaining Auckland, their destination. These points being settled, they continued to watch the savages till evening. Not one of them remained at the foot of the mountain, and when darkness invaded the valleys of the lake, no fire betokened the presence of the Maoris at the base of the peak. The coast was clear. At 9 o'clock it was dark night, and Glenarvan gave the signal for departure. His companions and he, armed and equipped at Karatit's expense, began to cautiously descend the slopes of the Maunganamu. Captain Mangles and Wilson led the way, with eyes and ears on the alert. They stopped at the least sound, they examined the faintest light, each slid down the declivity, the better to elude detection. 200 feet below the summit, Captain Mangles and his sailor reached the dangerous ridge that had been so obstinately guarded by the natives. If unfortunately, the Maoris, more crafty than the fugitives, had feigned a retreat to entice them within reach, if they had not been deceived by the eruption, their presence would be discovered at this point. Glenarvan, in spite of his confidence and Paganel's pleasantries, could not help trembling. The safety of his friends was at stake during the few moments necessary to cross the ridge. He felt Lady Helena's heart beat as she clung to his arm. But neither he nor Captain Mangles thought of retreating. The young captain, followed by the others, and favored by the dense obscurity, crawled along the narrow path, only stopping when some detached stone rolled to the base of the mountain. If the savages were still in ambush, these unusual sounds would provoke from each side a formidable volley. However, in gliding like serpents along this inclined crest, the fugitives could not advance rapidly. When Captain Mangles had gained the lowest part, scarcely 25 feet separated him from the plain where the natives had encamped the night before. Here the ridge ascended quite steeply towards a coppice, about 1/4 mile distant. Tabooed no longer. The travelers crossed this place without accident and began the ascent in silence. The thicket was invisible, but they knew where it was, and provided no ambuscade was laid there, Glenarvan hoped to find a secure refuge. However, he remembered that they were now no longer protected by the taboo. The ascending ridge did not belong to the sacred mountain, but to a chain that ran along the eastern shores of Lake Taupo. Therefore not only the shots of the savages, but also a hand-to-hand conflict, were to be feared. For a short time, the little party slowly mounted towards the upper elevations. The captain could not yet discern the dark coppice, but it could not be more than 200 feet distant. Suddenly he stopped and almost recoiled. He thought he heard some sound in the darkness. His hesitation arrested the advance of his companions. He stood motionless long enough to alarm those who followed him. With what agonizing suspense they waited could not be described. Would they be forced to return to the summit of the mountain? But finding that the noise was not repeated, their leader continued his ascent along the narrow path. The coppice was soon dimly defined in the gloom. In a few moments it was reached, and the fugitives were crouching beneath the thick foliage of the trees. Chapter 54.